Good afternoon, teachers. Well, you've made it to the end of the 1920 school year. You have done things you never thought you would do, you have learned things you never thought you would learn, and you have provided an education in a way you never thought you would have done with your kiddos. We are so proud that you have pushed yourselves, you have learned, and you have provided for your students. Thank you for all that you have done this year. It's an unprecedented times and you have stepped up to do unprecedented things. So thank you. Take this summer to rejuvenate and come back for the 2021 school year on fire and ready to teach your kids. It's going to look a little bit different. We don't know what it's going to look like, but thank you for being flexible and being part of the RCOE family.
So let's get started with our presentation. Now, our objectives for today. First and foremost, I want you to gain a better understanding of COVID-19. I also want you to understand the history of the public health orders. You're also going to gain a better understanding of current Riverside County public health orders. Now, again, important to specify that these orders that we're going to be looking at are more applicable for the school setting, so we got to keep that in mind. And then you're also going to understand the potential future implications in the school setting and what that might look like. Now, very important for you to understand that ultimately our guidance is going to come from the Department of Public Health. And, certainly they may seek information from the CDC, so evidence-based sort of practice and interventions that will be implemented in the school setting. But for now, I'm just giving you the potential future implications of what it might look like as we prepare to go back to school. First and foremost, it's important for us to have an understanding what is COVID-19. I'm sure that you've heard on the news all about COVID-19 and you might have a really good understanding of what it is. But let's start by giving you just some general background information. So COVID-19 is a novel coronavirus. So novel meaning new. Now, coronaviruses have been around for a very long time. So important for us to understand that there's different strains, and in fact some of the strains only impact animals. So that's the reason why when you would take your pet to the veterinarian, you would get the coronavirus vaccine. There are so many strains of coronavirus, so it's important for us to understand that piece. COVID-19, novel coronavirus. So obviously this is a new strain, and it's not the same as the coronaviruses that were commonly circulating in the past amongst humans. Now, these common viruses that were circulating among humans were causing mild illness, things like the common cold. Now, the concern with COVID-19 and why it's always going to be now on public health's radar when we're looking at it from an epidemiological perspective is because of the fact that there's that potential for death. Anytime that we have a new virus that can essentially wipe out communities, then of course, this is going to be on our radar, and it's very, very concerning because, within the public, we don't have the antibodies to protect us, like from things like influenzas and also vaccines, right? We don't have the vaccine for this yet. So obviously we're going to pay very close attention, and we're going to be very, very interested as to what's going on with COVID-19. Now we're talking about a very long incubation period, 14 days, and that is of significant concern because now we were having individuals that were out in the community and they were exposed to COVID-19, but they didn't know that they had it because signs and symptoms weren't becoming apparent until 14 days after. So that was another reason why this sort of got out of control and why we weren't able to put a handle on it very quickly. So these are some of the common coronaviruses that circulate, like I said, amongst humans. And for the most part, these coronaviruses here are just going to cause mild cold-like symptoms. So have you been exposed to coronavirus before? Quite possibly. You may have been exposed to some of these strains here. You wouldn't have even known it because, again, it just caused mild illness. And then we've got some other common coronaviruses that we're also very interested in, and you may recall MERS and SARS. But the difference, again, with the COVID-19 versus these common coronaviruses was the method that the individual was going to demonstrate signs and symptoms, and we were starting to see a lot of individuals that were dying from COVID-19 in comparison, again, to those that were circulating before the MERS and and the SARS, sure, there's always that potential that someone can expire, but the potential was far greater that somebody would expire if they had contracted COVID-19. So that bottom bullet point does highlight the fact that coronaviruses can infect animals and they can actually evolve. And once a person is exposed to that type of virus, then they themselves become ill. Now we call this zoonotic diseases. COVID-19 is indeed a zoonotic disease. So why is the disease called COVID-19? So the new name for the disease, the coronavirus disease, is abbreviated COVID-19. So in COVID-19, the CO actually stands for corona, the VI stands for virus, and the D is for disease. So then therefore we get the name COVID-19. Now 19 is actually the year that the disease was actually discovered. So formally this disease was referred to as the 2019 novel coronavirus, like I said, or the SARS-CoV. Okay, so then now let's segue into the history of school public health orders in Riverside County. Okay, so what did this look like from a historical perspective? Most of you will recall that on March 13th, the public health officer for Riverside County orders that the schools would be closed to avoid COVID-19 exposure. On March 20th, Riverside County was to help carry out the governor's stay-at-home orders. On March 31st, there was a new recommendation. So public health recommended that individuals that were going out in the community now had to wear a mask. And on April 2nd, which actually ended up being a requirement, right? If you were going to be out in public, the expectation was that you were going to be wearing a mask out in public. And then we have to understand that social distancing was always in the mix as it pertains to the history of public health orders. On April 2nd, the public health officer extends the school closure order to June 19th. So then now we're talking about keeping the schools closed. On May 8th, Riverside County reverted to state order. So the state order is kind of like the overall umbrella order that everybody has to follow, but then each county can choose to be more cautious and add additional guidance. So first and foremost, face coverings. Okay, so face coverings now. So remember, we talked about in the last slide that face coverings were not only recommended, but they actually became a requirement for a period of time, if you will recall. But now the current public health order in Riverside County is that face coverings and 6 feet of social distancing will be strongly recommended whenever practical and within reason. So certainly you're going to have community members that do not have face coverings, okay? Because again, it's a recommendation at this point in time. Organizations and businesses can implement their own policy and protocol. A business has the right to refuse service, or yeah, they have a right to refuse your business, right? Because of the fact that you're not adhering to their own standard. Now, as it pertains to schools, so local orders will remain in place for K through 12th grade, but local restrictions on higher education and vocational schools will be removed. So what does that look like? So, you know, now we have an understanding ultimately that universities and vocational schools can resume back to their, I don't want to say normal way of life, but they can actually resume to on-grid education. What that's going to look like, again, we need some further guidance from the Department of Public Health. You know, obviously they're recommending face masks, right? They're recommending social distancing. So then the expectation is that these higher education institutions are going to develop some type of policy or protocol that will address that recommendation. What is it going to look like for K through 12? We still have that understanding that until that hard date of June 19th, that the orders are going to essentially just remain the same. Okay, so what is that going to look like after June 19th? Well, that's the million-dollar question. Now, as it pertains to businesses, and just want to throw this in there, is that adopting best practices is some type of framework to guide the development for reopening Riverside County businesses. So obviously this is going to be done strategically. That's important for us to understand. So, you know, what are essential businesses at this point in time, and then gradually having those waves that we're seeing on the news of slowly reopening some of these businesses. So currently our school closure orders are as follows. All K through 12 public, private, and charter school within the jurisdiction of the public health officer of the County of Riverside are closed beginning March 16th and shall remain closed through June 19th. Inclusive pending further order, again, from the public health officer. So when I say that we need additional guidance, this is where that public health officer is really going to come into play to provide that additional guidance for us. Individual school districts and educational institutions have the discretion to determine the minimum number of essential personnel that they actually want. So it's important for schools to keep in mind that essential personnel should essentially support critical functions within school districts. Now, the order does not apply to general food, daycare, and childcare services. Childcare must be carried out in stable groups of only 12 or less children, okay? And children will not change from one group to another. And then essentially the guidance is that groups shouldn't be mixing with other groups, okay? So that's really interesting how that impacts daycare and childcare facilities. But what are some of the recommendations at this point in time as per the CDC? Now, have an understanding that at the end of the day, each school district is going to adopt their own policies and procedures. But again, if the recommendation is that we're adhering to that guidance of public health. So let's talk about isolation, okay, first and foremost. Now, school districts should be prepared to follow public health guidance regarding exclusion and isolation protocols for sick children and staff identified at the time of arrival and throughout the school day. So in the event of a confirmed or suspected case of COVID-19 among students or staff, schools should have in place some type of guidance on, what is it going to look like for cleaning and with regards to contingency plans for closing classrooms, right? Or even closing schools or even closing school districts based off identified cases. And of course, in compliance with public health and CDC guidelines. Now, disinfecting, obviously this is going to be huge, a huge part of the planning process as it pertains to, opening up schools again. So implementation of measures to limit the spread of COVID-19 within the school setting. So how are we going to do that? Well, the recommendation right now is that we need to ensure that we have appropriate disinfectant and sanitizing procedures, okay? We're also going to need to look at screening and monitoring and testing for illness among potentially staff and of course students. And then what about the use of masks, right? So that is going to be problematic in itself, especially when we're faced with challenges where we can't even obtain the appropriate personal protective equipment. And then now we're going to have students that might potentially have to wear masks, right? And again, we're talking about our special education populations, our emotionally disturbed children or our autistic children. How is that going to work out, right? So there's a lot of factors that need to be taken into consideration. Limiting interactions of students is going to be critical. So, again, what is that going to look like? We obviously don't have the answers to that, but certainly public health officials are working to provide that guidance. And equipment is going to be critical. So personal protective equipment for those suspected to have COVID-19 should be utilized, all pending recommendations from public health and CDC. Masks, again, are going to be critical, right? Do we not? Again, we're waiting for more direction from public health. But other things like gloves are going to be important, soap and water, alcohol-based 60% hand sanitizer if no soap and water is present. Now, we all have this understanding that washing our hands with soap and water is the best defense. Okay, so not necessarily hand sanitizer, right? There's a misconception, well, if I've got hand sanitizer, I'm good. Hand sanitizer should only be utilized when you don't have access to soap and water, okay? And in fact, in the hospital setting, there's a limitation as to how many times a registered nurse can use hand sanitizer when entering a patient's room, and then they actually have to follow up with washing their hands with soap and water. So what are some additional potential implications for the schools? Well, what's going to happen when somebody has a diagnosis of COVID-19, right? So certainly our protocols are going to need to be updated. But it's important for you to understand, again, until there's clear guidance from the local health department, we need to ensure that at this point in time, we're adhering to the CDC guidelines. And their CDC guidelines are as follows. So for a symptom-based strategy, a person needs to remain home at least 10 days. They shouldn't have a fever for 72 hours. That's 3 full days without the use of fever-reducing medications. we want to ensure that other symptoms have also improved, and this includes cough and shortness of breath. Well, that guidance again is going to come from our local Department of Public Health. Now, group size. School districts should anticipate continued restriction on that physical distancing and that group size, again, per the CDC and or local or state health departments. So scheduling and staffing models must be prepared to accommodate having fewer students, possibly, right? Having fewer students and staff in a given classroom. This is also obviously going to impact a sporting event. It's likely that these sporting events might be limited, right? So what is that going to do for some of our school children that really like to engage in those extracurricular activities? Again, we are waiting for that additional guidance and information. Mental health is going to be significant in the schools, and we've got to utilize our school psychologists and help us, you know, especially since they have that training to help guide us with the decisions and the interventions that are being implemented. So schools should be encouraged to adopt an approach on universal services for mental health support for all students. Teachers and other school personnel should receive some type of training on how to talk to and support children during a pandemic, and the principles of psychological first aid. You know, until we have that clear guidance from the Department of Public Health, they'll be able to make those recommendations for us. Students requiring more mental health support, including those who are exhibiting suicidal ideation, should be referred to for additional services, and that's pretty self-explanatory. Anybody that we identify that has a suicidal thought, we're obviously going to refer out to those professionals that can handle that particular situation. Support should be provided to grieving students as well as those experiencing other losses. And schools are encouraged to contact students who do not return to school, as they may be experiencing school avoidance. So that's going to be another challenge that we're going to be faced with, this, you know, anxiety that is resulting from this pandemic. I don't want to go to school. I don't want to be around people. I'm scared, right? And certainly that is a very valid concern, and we must be in constant communication with these individuals. So stigma is going to be another sort of factor that needs to be taken into consideration. So obviously it already exists, and it's related to fear and anxiety associated with the COVID-19. So reducing stigma and counter bias and bullying is going to be really important. So then therefore we're going to need to provide education and intervention resources to help prevent this potential bias incidents of bullying, especially for those students that are at greater risk. And we're talking about students that have Asian ethnicity, those students that were homeless, right? Because we've got a lot of students that are homeless, those that are receiving free lunch, or even those that may have moved, right? So why are you moving? You know, what's the reason? Or maybe even a student that had a potential exposure, right, to COVID-19. So we have to address that stigma, and that's going to be a significant problem as well. And then of course, we've already talked about supporting social distancing. So what is that going to look like in the school setting, right? If recommendation is that we observe social distancing measures at 6 feet, what is that going to look like in the actual school setting? So some considerations, okay, that are floating out there as per CDC guidelines, again, considerations only, nothing to be implemented as of yet, but some considerations are things like staggered start times, okay? Or even staggering academic days, where some students will come in the morning and some students will come in the afternoon. Certainly we're going to limit activities with large groups. Okay, that's pretty self-explanatory. And we're also going to need to work with specialists for things like PE, music, art, recess, and even the cafeteria, right? What is that going to look like? So then now we actually would need to revise to small group and outdoor activities, because again, you know, if we're outside, that possibility of transmission is decreased significantly than being indoors, right? But then now we've got to have smaller groups as well. So what is all of that going to look like? You certainly aren't going to want to share any musical instruments, right? So no longer can we share musical instruments. Limited use of playground equipment, right? These are things that need to be taken into consideration. A possibility of having lunches inside of the classroom to limit large groups, right, in the cafeteria. And then what are we going to do about recess and passing periods, right? What is that structure going to look like as well? And ultimately, the goal is to establish a safer environment in the school setting. So then as a result, we're certainly going to have to review and modify our emergency plans, our evacuation plans, and our shelter in place plans. So there's going to be a lot of modifications that are going to need to take place in order for students to be safe and healthy in the school setting. Okay, so I hope that this was able to shed some light as it pertains to our current public health orders in Riverside County. It's a very fluid situation. It's consistently evolving. So we have to have that understanding as well that what was said here in this presentation is not gospel, right? So we have that understanding that at the end of the day, you know, our direction is going to come from the Department of Public Health, okay? And of course, we're going to utilize some large federal agencies as well, the CDC, and it may be even some global agencies like the World Health Organization as well. So then therefore, this slide here is your support team as it pertains to COVID-19. I want to let you know that these are some amazing school nurses, and the school nurses have been a part of the public health calls that we have every week. They've been part of the planning phase as well. So certainly please do not hesitate to reach out to one of your amazing school nurses for your area should you have any questions. But again, it's really important for us to mention that we don't have all of the answers to your questions, unfortunately, because the reality is that we have to wait for that guidance from the Department of Public Health. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, and I thank you so much for listening to this presentation. My information is there, so should you need to email me, please feel free to email me. And then, of course, I have my references there.
Well, between Jack's back taxes and the Fred Hayes show, I'd say that was a pretty successful broadcast.
That's an excellent show, Oscar.
Thank you very much, Houston.
We got a couple of housekeeping procedures for you. We'd like you to roll right to 060 and know your rates.
Roger that. Rolling right. 060.
And then if you could give your oxygen tanks a stir.
Roger that. Hey, we've got a problem here.
What did you do?
Nothing. I stirred the tanks.
Whoa. Hey.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we have a problem. We have a...
Flight, their heart rates are skyrocketing.
Econ, what's your data telling you?
O2 tank 2 not reading at all. Tank 1 is at 725 psi and falling. Fuel cells 1 and 3 are, oh boy, what's going on here? Flight, let me get back to you. Flight GNC?
Gene, we have a situation brewing with the carbon dioxide.
We had a CO2 filter problem on the lunar module,
5 filters on the limb.
which were meant for 2 guys for a day and a half. So I told the doc,
You're already up to 8 on the gauges. Anything over 15 and you get impaired judgment, blackouts, the beginnings of brain asphyxia.
What about the scrubbers on the command module?
They take square cartridges.
The ones on the limb are round.
Tell me this isn't a government operation.
This just isn't a contingency we've remotely looked at.
Those CO2 levels are going to be getting toxic.
Well, I suggest you gentlemen invent a way to put a square peg in a round hole. Rapidly.
Okay, people, listen up. People upstairs handed us this one, and we gotta come through. We gotta find a way to make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that. Let's get it organized.
Okay, let's build a filter.
Better get some coffee going, too, someone.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am here to talk about the theme for today's PLC. It's no materials, no problem. And we're here to be creative using items in the home to teach reading, math, and life skills. So basically what I'm gonna show you are different things that I found in the internet on how we could help parents still work on some of the skills that they have not been working on since they are not in the school setting. So basically just using what they have in the home. I'd like to start with, I know that most of you are probably looking for something funny because every time I do a presentation, I have a funny video to show. But for the interest of time, I think I only have 5 minutes for this introduction. So it's really just putting some sort of perspective as to how we could be creative during the time of a pandemic, how we become creative as teachers. So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the Dalgona coffee trend that's been going around. So basically a lot of us are not able to go to Starbucks as much as we want. And so people have been creative online, and they have discovered the beauty of a Dalgona coffee. So I'm going to show you how to do that using very simple ingredients. It's just really 3 ingredients that you need from the home. So you just need water and coffee and sugar, and then you just whisk it for about 8 minutes. And the ratio is just for every 1 tablespoon of coffee, you use 1 tablespoon of sugar and 1 tablespoon of water. And there you go. I'm just going to fast forward it. And there you go. You have a fancy looking glass of coffee to enjoy while you are doing your Zoom or your Google Classroom. All right, so here we go. Here are some of the examples that I wanted to show you just to give you an idea on what you could come up with. I know some of you are probably going to discuss about Boom cards and the quizzes that are available in the Google Quiz Classroom thing, but some of our parents do not have access to the internet all the time, or they only are sharing 1 computer at home. So maybe we could use some of the items that are, sitting there on their kitchen table, such as a grocery ad. So the grocery ad, you could actually teach a lot of reading skills using those. So basically, if you look at the first column, you could see that they could do like a receptive language drill with the ads. Or they could also do matching. So similar to like what you have for the cover of a Target catalog, you can have the student cut out letters or find uppercase letters and versus lowercase letters. And then they could also identify vowels and consonants. They could also figure out how to, find the different beginning sounds of each letter, and sight words, and building sentences and stories based on the pictures that they see. And another use of, well, it's not really the ads anymore, but it's really just how you could convert snack time into a learning opportunity. So they could do, while they're eating cereal, they could do matching. So you could like color a piece of paper, different colors of the cereal, and they just match pink with pink and blue with blue. Or green, draw a tree, and they could put the green grapes to as a background for the tree, and the trunk would be nuts or whatever is colored brown in their snack for their snack for that day. They could also sort all the different cereals based on color, or the different food items based on you know, like all the grapes together, all the carrots together. Or they could also do patterns, so a carrot, like an ABAB pattern using what they're eating in the home. And then you could do counting, you could do addition, and you could also do graphing using snacks. So we just really have to be creative. There's a lot of things that we could help our parents with when it comes to teaching these skills using whatever they have in the home. So from the pantry and the fridge, there are other skills that we could teach them, such as reading skills. They could, you know, they could label the different objects, they could match the letters, find 2 items in the pantry that start with the letter C, or they could figure out a way wherein get all the items from the pantry and then arrange them in alphabetical order. So it's a higher level cognitive skill type of a lesson. And then they could also sort the different categories based on what they have in the pantry. They could actually do a survey as to how many items they have in their fridge. And whatever you have in the fridge or the pantry, you could also teach them measuring skills. And then for the home, these are usual pantry items like a vinegar and salt and honey. If they have those items, they could actually do a science experiment and have the different skills that we could associate with science experiments, such as asking questions and making comments, and then for them to be able to retell, you know, what happened when they mix baking soda with water and vinegar. So there's a lot of language that we could get out of our students using household items. And then simple activities such as laundry, wherein we could teach them how to match and make patterns and sequence things. They could learn about letters with whatever you have on the shirt that you're gonna wash, and you could have them sort. You could have them arrange it from small to big. And then just really even addition and subtraction is a possible type of a lesson while you're doing laundry. So basically those are just examples of what we thought would be a creative way of using the different things that they have in the home setting. So I believe Amy will discuss or has discussed how to use the activity matrix from the Captain website. So if you're interested to download that, that would be in that website right there. And then there's also an example of a form that has been filled out, so you can take a look at that as well. So I guess that's it. Good luck today, you guys. And for those ending the school year next week, have fun and stay safe and healthy. Bye, everybody.